Welcome to Dare to Speak, difficult conversations that can change everything. This is a place for you to bring those difficult conversations that you've been mulling over, that you've been thinking about while you've been walking around, doing the washing up or commuting to work. I'm Eve Stanway. I am a philosopher, psychotherapist of 25 years, divorce and breakup coach, and I help people in the moments where there's a difficult conversation they just don't know how to handle. This is a moment, your moment, to pause, reflect, and have a bit of breathing space to think about what matters to you and how to tackle those difficult moments. Using insight, reflection, case studies, and examples, I will guide you through those difficult conversations in a safe and constructive way. So let's begin. Hello and welcome to Dare to Speak, difficult conversations that change everything. As those of you who listen regularly know, I have been bringing guests on to talk about difficult conversations and the lives that they have where difficult conversations are happening both in personal and in professional settings. And I'm really delighted today to have Anthony Astbury here, who is the founder of the Whole Man Academy. The Whole Man Academy works with professional men to develop them and offer them. Well, I'm going to ask you, Anthony, to actually explain rather than me try and put it in my own words. What do you do with the Whole Man Academy?
Good question. Well, I kind of potted history of reason why I worked in the city for nearly 20 years. Worked with obviously hundreds and hundreds of professional men. And I got to that stage of feeling like you were living Groundhog Day, where you were, spending 200 hours a month at your desk, making a lot of money for people you probably would never meet and getting a small slice of it and then giving half that to the government through the tax and thinking, there's got to be more to life than this. And in a way, for me, when I call it the Whole Man Academy, it's personal development for professional men. I would say not just professional men, but ambitious men who probably want to reignite their drive. And I think everybody's driven to some extent because, you have to have some kind of drive to just exist, if that makes sense. But there's levels of it. So I always try and take a guy who I would say finds himself in the gap. And that gap is somewhere between what he wants and what the life he thinks he could have, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I've been running events since 2018 in London, in the Cotswolds, in Winchester. And I do private coaching, I have a podcast, I've written books, I have a membership, 3 different tiers of membership. I do 2-day retreats. I've done corporate talks at Spotify, Daily Mail, Lloyds Bank, Credit Suisse, etc. And ultimately, all of that is tools to try and help that primarily middle-aged man who knows he's capable of more, but is bloody hard doing it on your own.
Yeah. Okay. So that's quite a wide sweep. And, what attracted me to talk to you in the first place and bring you on the podcast is that sweep of things that you are offering is something that I know because I work with a lot of men going through separation and divorce, and they're often at a loss about where to access that kind of support. There is I would say that there's a bit of a shortage, or there feels like there's a shortage on that kind of men supporting men with the things in this kind of balanced way that you're offering and looking at that whole thing. And then I see during separation and divorce, and I'm sure some of your clients must be going through that can really take the wheels off the bus, as it were. Is that what you find? Like, what do you notice of you?
Funny enough, the conversation we're having now is so, what's the word? I want to say time sensitive or relevant, because I say so much of a man's life is built up through 2 big things, which one is his business or his career, and the other one is the woman that he decides to spend some or all of his life with, and in theory, share his bed with as well, which is all interlinked. And interestingly, at the moment, there's quite a few guys I know who have reached that midlife thing. And I believe in an ideal world, you would meet the person that you want to be with and stay with him forever and live happy ever after. That's great. And I know plenty that have done that, but that isn't always possible because I think we change as men, women change, you have kids, you have all these different moving parts that makes up a relationship. And quite a few guys I know have recently had these struggles with their partner, wife, girlfriend, long-term partner, whatever. And And it's bloody hard because that's so important to get right. The point of why we're talking is about difficult relationships and the conversations you have around those. If you're not prepared to have those conversations, it's probably not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. So yeah, that's a massive part of what I talk about, but also the men that I work with. Again, funny, I was talking about this very much today. If you have a brilliant business and career, but at home things have gone down the pan, it's hard, but at least you've got work as your keeps you busy. If both are in trouble, then you've got a problem. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you. But it's massive for men and women, obviously.
Yeah, I think there's so many things I could pick up on there, but I think what I see during, and I'm always going to come at this from kind of family breakdown point of view, because that's where I come in, and that's also where I'm really interested in having your views, because although I work a lot with men, I can't, you are a man and you work with men. So what I see sometimes happening is, just as you say, that home life and the work life all being impacted, and the support for men in those moments, the ability to know how to actually have these conversations. I hear it a lot. I hear it very, very often. Men don't know how to talk about their feelings, and they don't know that. My experience is a bit different than that. My experience is that men do know how to talk about their feelings, or sometimes they may struggle to say them, but they can write them.
Yeah.
And so I think there's almost a kind of trope. There's almost a...
There's different ways. I mean, you're right in that a lot of men struggle maybe there's no outlet for them. I think that's one of the big things. Yeah. And, the work you do or the work I do, which is different, but ultimately you're trying to lead someone to the same thing, which is improving their life and taking away some of the stress. A lot of men just keep things locked up, which I understand. That seems very noble and stoic and whatever, very lone wolf. But ultimately, there are tools out there to help. And I think for a lot of guys, they'll, to their own detriment, keep things to themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to go onto bloody LinkedIn and post a picture of yourself crying and tell everybody about it, because what you're going to get then is some people that will say, like, basically, they'll just call you a twat and say you're just doing it for likes or comments or whatever. And then you'll have people arguing in the comments. For me, whatever life struggles you have, but especially if it's a relationship, difficult conversations, there are avenues out there to help with this stuff. It's just knowing where to access it, because primarily for men, middle-aged men and upwards, you haven't grown up with this access to anything at all.
No. And I think that's a really good point. I think the generations, when I look at my son, for example, he's 24 and he's got a good friendship group around, but he has been raised in an environment when to talk about feelings and to seek help and for mental health not to be a sign that you're a wuss and stuff like that is something that he's very well aware of, partly because he's got me as a mum, but also when I look at the other kids, they generally, not entirely, but they can often be a lot more aware that there's stuff. When I'm looking at men kind of in the maybe 40s, 50s or 60s year old, they kind of know that you can or should be able to talk about this stuff, but they've had years and years of conditioning that says it's just a bit pathetic to need to talk about your feelings. Of course, it's not. It's essential. Our feelings are how we're experiencing the world. And if we can't tell people how we're experiencing, I often say to people, it's like the dials on your car. The dials on your car dashboard are telling you how the car is experiencing the road and the drive. If we just cover them up in gaffer tape, we're not going to know what's happening, and then we can't do anything about it.
The right analogy you gave there, when I say covering up, hence why it's one of the many reasons why the male suicide rate is not only the suicide rate is, for me, too high. I mean, 0 is a good suicide rate, if that makes sense. But I know, people that say we want to stamp that out completely, I think you're, fooling yourself. That's really possible. Yeah. But when you've got guys that, sadly, why is it that more men than women take their own lives? And, the statistics are kind of blow my mind sometimes. And I sadly know, thankfully not totally personally, but, a lot of guys in my groups who have either, and again, on paper, you'd say, look, these guys have got money and families. And it's not that you'd say, oh, they were doing badly in business and they were broke or whatever. These people on paper are doing well, but something has happened, a build-up of things or something that has taken them to that point. So for men, the question isn't always just, why aren't you talking to someone? It's who's going to listen.
I do agree with that. And It's interesting from a therapeutic point of view, complex loss, complex bereavement, repeated hits, a loss of a job, having to move out of your home, a loss of, whatever it might be, a loss of people in your life and things like that happen, the loss of opportunities. So each one of these losses registers as a loss within the cycle of anger and denial and bargaining and sadness and acceptance. What I think happens, though, is people are encouraged to see that as depression. Oh, you must be depressed. You're not talking, so you must be depressed. But if you're not talking because you're in the denial part or the shutdown part of grief, or perhaps you're just in freeze, you're in physiological freeze because so much has happened, and that gets talked about as if it's depression. Well, depression is a very, very different entity. Certainly clinical depression is. So it means that the treatment, there's an awful lot of people diagnosing stuff without going and doing the training, basically. So I think you're quite right. The mental health crisis in men is massive. And what that's doing is it's having a knock-on effect in a loss of fathers. And I am concerned about that because I was raised by a dad. My dad raised me from the age of 7. He was a difficult man. I learned a lot about difficult conversations with him. But I really see a concern with the loss of fathers because it means that you're not getting to see children aren't getting to see those two different ways of going about doing things. And undoubtedly men kind of generally do things different than women. And so for me, that's a massive concern because within that loss of life that's happening, there's also a loss of people, there's a loss of connection, there's a loss of interaction and parenting and grandparenting and uncling and brothering and, all of those things.
The lack of fatherhood, the more time I've spent in the men's personal development space, let's call it that, the more it sounds obvious to say that, the right dad is very important. And I've said before, some guys didn't have a dad around, and that shouldn't be that doesn't guarantee they're not going to be a success in life. But what they've found hard is not having that father figure and that masculine energy, or just understand how a man treats a woman, how he acts, how he works out, all these different things. And also, you've also got guys that did have a dad around and he was useless. He was either abusive or a drunk or just, maybe he's got his own trauma from other stuff before. And I've sat at events which I was very clear that my events are, for want of a better phrase, it's for ambitious men who want to admit where they are in life and move forward. But it's not always bad sometimes to look back at what's happened in the past because it has a huge bearing. And I've heard men before who say that they'd attempted suicide, but their dad had killed himself and his dad had killed himself. So you're like, oh my God, no wonder that you've already grown up with this kind of, that's normal, which we know highly abnormal to do that. But you just see like generational learnings.
I agree.
And that comes to, funny, we said difficult conversations. Those can be difficult in the fact that if men were thinking of taking their life, of course, that's difficult conversations. But also to a small level, even if guys are struggling at work with not knowing what to do or at home with their marriage or their sex life or their finances or what have you, there are difficult conversations there because you might not want to talk to your friends about it because you're embarrassed or you look like an idiot because you don't want to admit that you don't know what you're doing. And I think that's where, when you talk about difficult conversations, people assume that's the really hard, gritty conversations. But actually, there's, some guys that I get messages from, interestingly, they'll say to me, I saw a post of yours on LinkedIn or an article I'd written. And I'll think, I've never seen them like anything before. And the guy will say, no, I've never liked any of your things because I don't want other people on LinkedIn, for example, because it pops up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like something about this, therefore everybody knows. So
it's public.
Conversations are all around us.
I think it's so true. And I have a lot of conversations with people about really mundane stuff. So I talk sometimes about, I've just done last podcast was about this, which was about the job, which is an ongoing job, stuff that needs to be doing, that you're just rolling with. And then there's other stuff, which is a really discrete job, which is I call it a start to finish job where, I've just discovered it's no mow May, so I'm not mowing my lawn. But say I've got to go, I've got to pick up the dog poo, I've got to clear away the stuff, then I've got to get the mower out, then I've got to do it and get rid of the grass and eventually all put it away and then it's done. So that's a start to finish job and kind of talking about the difference between that And how, if you don't know that your wife or your partner's expectation is that you're going to do this full job and you've done a bit of the job and you think that you're going to get praise and you don't understand why you're going to get the kind of, no, you're not going to get that appreciated. It can have a cumulative detrimental effect. And that would be the kind of thing I think that a dad would have taught somebody. This is how you mow the lawn. This is how you put shelves up and tidy up afterwards. These might sound like, I'm being very kind of masculine and feminine in the jobs. But for me, these are jobs that are really good for, men are really good at doing stuff like that if they've been taught.
It's funny, it drives me mad on LinkedIn where there's always people that show like fake, very short-term outrage for things that are just absolutely waste of energy. Yesterday I saw it that there's a food company that have done an advert which kind of encourages kids to eat and says, "Mummy will be so pleased if you take a mouthful of this." And you can guarantee, now, if you took, let's say, 500 men that filled in my online quiz, okay, I reckon out of those 500 men, if all of them assuming have got a wife and children, that about 80% of those, the wife cooks most of the dinners for the kids. Probably because, I'm not saying they wouldn't be working, but I bet the dad primarily is more out working. That's the nature of the male breadwinner. But you see on LinkedIn where people like, this is disgusting, how can they? And I'm like, firstly, your outrage over something that's basically a big waste of energy. But also, if you look at the numbers, you realise nearly all the guys I deal with, they're all at work, they're working long hours. If they've got, they're juggling the shit out of life like everybody else. And that's what always makes me laugh when people get so outraged about these very small, technicalities. And you realise that most people are still living that kind of life.
The glass ceiling, if you want to call it that, the disparity in income, the disparity in savings, in pensions, all of these things you see at the really hard edge during separation and divorce. Because the reality is, although there has been, there have been massive, massive shifts, and that is good. The woman working and at home, which is what women ended up with, and the man working and then being at home in a much more limited way is still the norm. I just want to, if we think about difficult conversations, so one of the things that I teach in my framework, I've got the listen, speak, lead framework. I have listening is about learning the difference between our interpretation of what's going on and making an inquiry about what is going on. Our ability to actually want to know what the other person is saying and thinking, even if you don't agree with it, because how, again, they're receiving the world or how you're receiving the world does matter. Then I move on to speaking, which is how would you have a conversation and talk about one thing? And I encourage people to think about what the outcome is. So I'd really like to talk to you about this. The outcome is I'd like to have an agreement about who puts the bins out or who's going to take, the kids, or how many days off you're going to take in the half term that's coming up. And then being able to stick to that through leadership of, first of all, stopping the conversation if it does get heated, but being able to keep it on that point. So I suppose my question to you, and this is I think women, not always, and again, I'm sure the commenters will comment, but I think women are more likely to fluidly move around from space to space a lot of the time, just part naturally, because that's what women do. And for men, I think that can be quite confusing sometimes, because you're not sure what we're actually talking about sometimes.
Yeah.
Is that thing? Do you think that that's true? Because that's my perception. That, I mean, I'm generalising. These are broad strokes.
Yeah. If we're talking about the conversation between male and female, men, and I know this because I speak to so many men.
I know, that's why you're here.
and can never understand what the bloody hell is going on in a woman's mind. And I remind men, it's probably because women probably half the time don't know either. And not to say because they're not in control of their mind, but for a lot of people, what you're thinking and what you've said can often be misinterpreted. So, as you said, if your wife says one thing, it doesn't mean she means that. She might be, it's a code for something else. And then it comes down to, and again, this crosses the male-female divide, both sides. Some people are more affectionate than others, and their love languages. And, I've written about it where, you know, for me, I know some people that have acts of service that they see value in, whereas other men, you know, I've talked to men that will say, I just want my partner to give me a hug.
Yeah.
And if you go deep on that, you know, sit on the sofa or chair and wrap her legs around me, wrap her arms around me, and like play with my hair.
Yeah,
And
no, listen.
yeah, and men are simple creatures, the same as women in that respect. So this is what I was trying to say to men. Just because a woman has said something, it doesn't mean that's what she actually wants. It's that there's something else. You know, you need to look deeper than that. But it is hard because also, and I spoke about this a lot recently, I try and remind men, and I look back through my years of dating before, some girlfriends I had that at one point I'd think, my God, she's mental. Like her behavior is mad. But I hadn't thought, what time of the month is it? How are her hormones reacting? You know, because men are basically a flat level playing field, as it were. Women through the cycle are up and down, up and down. And also, if a woman has given birth or is breastfeeding, is tired because of that, all these things that basically mean it's very bloody hard to know what the hell people are thinking.
I completely agree with you. And I don't think it's helped by the modern age where people are rushing and often looking for solutions. And that's why I kind of go back to the way we're feeling is the data that tells us how we're experiencing the world, and getting that attunement, getting that alignment. I agree with what you say. I talk to a lot of men and myself, and affection is something that's really important. It's actually important in primate society, and in the end we are primates. But physical touch and affection, once it becomes loaded or it becomes guarded, or like, well, no, I don't want to hug because it'll lead somewhere and I don't want to go into that place. I've talked to a lot of men and they're really heartbroken about they're no longer. And I think that happens as well. I've worked with a lot of men through their wives' menopause, for example, where women can be very, very different, can be, during, but then afterwards kind of go back to a real joy of life again. But by then the marriage is over, or people have shut down, or they are, and this can happen. I've worked with female clients where men have been through prostate problems or other health issues where they've kind of switched off that, you know,
the affection,
that more sensual or affectionate side has been like gone, and then the woman doesn't know how to get it back.
And then you drift apart. I mean, this is such a massive topic because, again, you don't hear much spoken about it. But I've spoke to enough men, and in a way, let's pick an age of, like, let's say a man's 40, and they might have had their first baby, not the man, woman. Obviously, men can't have babies, and she then maybe had a difficult birth or has gone through, you know, the stress afterwards of breastfeeding and blah, blah, blah. Or she had a cesarean, she may be, out of action, I mean, for sex. I mean, just generally, she can't do stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, it's new to her. And what would happen for him is that, you know, you give, let's say, a few months, but you don't ever stop needing and desiring sex and touch and kisses and whatever. Yeah. But at what point do you, as a man, then turn around and say, what about me here? And it's not because you're being selfish, it's because you have this inner need. What you then see is the man will suppress that for 3 months, 6 months, maybe have some difficult conversations. If nothing's happened, unfortunately, if you don't show some of the affection they need, they will go off and find it somewhere else.
So I see that as well. And I can see those barriers start to form. And I think, again, it does go back in part to a lack of understanding, but a lack of conversation. I remember reading in, I think it was John Gottman's The 7 Principles of a Successful Marriage. And he said, you know, the closeness within the family unit comes very much from the extent to which the man supports the woman when the woman has the baby. In those first bits where the woman is very, very connected to the baby because she might be feeding or whatever it is, the extent to which the man is supporting the woman in that moment. And that he identified that as being a time when kind of conflict happens, or that kind of sense of loss and distance builds in. And I think that partly happens because there's a lack of that wider support and people are exhausted. I talked to a young dad. He said, he's got 1 kid now and he's a lovely, lovely dad. And he's changing. He's trying to do intergenerational change between his upbringing and the way he's bringing up his own kid. And I kind of love him for that. But he was saying, I remember when his wife was pregnant, his girlfriend was pregnant, they're not married. And he said, everybody was just telling him that life would be over. He wouldn't have any holidays, he wouldn't have any fun, he wouldn't have any sex, he wouldn't have any cuddles, he wouldn't have any anything. And he was being bombarded with people telling him that, to
Yeah.
the extent that I went, well, most of that's in your control. Like, there's literally, you can go on holiday, be very nice and support your girlfriend and do these things and be the dad and learn. And she doesn't know how to do it. You don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Learn. It's a skill. You can literally learn parenting. And thank goodness children are forgiving as we learn.
And it's that honest conversation that is lacking often, the key to, I say not necessarily fully solving that, but at least addressing it and airing it so you can both not be thinking, oh, well, she should have known what I was thinking, or he should know what I don't, he should know I don't have sex.
Yeah, or just really, and again, these are the conversations I have of like exactly the sensitivities that females feel around their body, around their shape, around I remember when I've got two children, when I had my son, I was honestly, the thought that my body could change enough to become heavily pregnant,
Yes,
and then push out a child and then feed that child.
Return back as well, yeah.
And then return was like mind-blowing. And a lot of the messaging I received was, oh, you'll never get your figure back, you'll never do that. And all of that seeds in a lack of possibility, a lack of agency, a lack of choice.
I think there's a good rabbit hole to go down about let's call it the destruction of the family unit over the years. Yeah. And one of the things I think that also has done is when you force women to think that they should be going out to work all the time, and this pathetic movement of like boss babe, which means that women I've spoken to have felt guilt because they're not juggling the kids and doing the home stuff, keeping the home fires burning and trying to be some big success, when actually the biggest success you can have and the hardest job is being a great mum for your family. And for me, that frustration is that you get mums who are trying to do it all, and I get it, you're kind of force-fed this bullshit story. And then I spoke to some women that have looked back on life and said they'd sent their kids off to school, to nursery as soon as possible after they've had them, gone straight back to work to prove something to the fact that nobody else gives a shit, but your kids need you as a mummy. And then you've got the husband who, these days with the, let's call it the inflation, the cost of living, you are getting people that are having to both go out to work, and they're both so tired after, either dropping the kids at school and cooking dinners, and the dad's doing this, the mum's doing this. By the end of the night, where's the time for the sex and even the just cuddling and kissing? Yeah.
There's no longer that alignment because there isn't. I mean, I just think it's like any professional team. You will have the mental load everyone talks about. Really, that's who's project managing it and who's in charge of the implementation of what needs to be done. People having their tasks, finishing their tasks, knowing what their tasks are, knowing when the rest is, knowing what's actually reasonable. But it comes down to whether we're able to have those conversations. And most people are running on whatever tools they got given by their parents. That's it. They haven't got anything else to be able to say, I'm really unhappy. I don't like what's happening. I'd love to have a chat. So when I'm working with couples, and I do a lot of work to improve marriages, my feeling is if your ship is heading to the rocks, you can just go and crash and get done by the shipwreckers, or what you can do is try and steer away. So as a divorce coach, I spend as much time saving marriages as I do guiding people to end them if that's the right thing. And if I see a marriage and it's definitely toxic misbehavior, I will say that. But getting the marriages to work again means getting two people in alignment to realize how strong we are when we've got two people who are in alignment and working together. Like, difficult conversations actually create connection. That's my messaging. It makes it better.
Well, we're not brought up to have these difficult, we're not taught to have these difficult conversations. And I always kind of look at relationships in two ways. I did a podcast with a Californian police detective once who we talked about relationships and how important they are to have ideally a harmonious relationship. And he said that he did some coaching with men, and he said, just for fun, I want to say fun, tongue in cheek, because you'll see the seriousness of this. If you go to your wife/partner and you say to her this simple question, what could I do to make your day a 10?
Yeah.
Because what you think she wants you to do and what she actually wants are probably completely different things. And it just, opens up a possibility of you being like, oh, well, that's actually more simple. I have no idea you wanted that.
Yeah.
And the other one was a guy who I spoke to who was, again, funny, based out in Texas on my podcast. And he was a good reminder. He said, if you meet when you're in your 20s, by the time you're in your 30s, we've all changed. And not just mentally, but physically. Unfortunately, none of us are exactly the same as we were in our 20s, where everything was a bit more pert. And, by the time you get to your 50s and 60s, kids, work, everything else, we do change. So if you're thinking that, if you're not showing up as the man you should be in a relationship, why should you expect them to as well?
I completely agree. And the brain development, the functional MRIs have really demonstrated how brains continue to develop in life. And they do. So the person you met in your 20s and you had kids with and you did all of that is going to be different in the 40s and the 50s. They should be, because humans also grow and develop as we experience things. And that's one reason why kids very often haven't had enough experience to know. Whereas as adults, we are learning and improving things.
Yeah.
So what I think is having that in mind, having the fluidity and the flexibility and the understanding that if I'm finding it difficult having a conversation, the chances are our communication is just missing. If you don't know what your other half is thinking, you don't know what they're thinking, what they're doing. And this is a key part of what and I really think, I know we're coming to the end, but I do want to kind of say this. One of the key things that happens is, and I have it in my framework, is being able to tolerate discomfort. So being able, if your partner says something and it is something that's uncomfortable for you, how you tolerate that without freaking out or becoming defensive, and whether or not you can ask another question.
Yeah.
It's really, really key, isn't it? Can I keep asking a question instead of jumping to I know what you think the answer is now?
Yeah, that aligns perfectly with, when I've talked I've done 145 of my own podcasts, so I've had conversations, and they're all with men from special forces, CEOs, world champion fighters, Olympic gold medal, a whole range of men. And one of the things you go back to is, again, one thing that men all wish they could do is understand women more. Now, that might be to have a harmonious marriage. It might be to get more, whichever one they're both. But saying to a woman, if you're talking to her and saying, what I'm hearing you say is this. Go, no. Or yes, perfect. And if they say perfect, great, you're on the right track. If they say no, hopefully they'll put you on the right track. So simple nugget of, okay, what I'm hearing you, I know you've said you want me to do this. What I'm hearing you say is this. Like, am I on the right track? If it's a yes, great. If it's a no, put me on the right track. And that alone can kind of save.
It does. But I think that in order to be able to do that, so if somebody says, you always talk to me really badly, being able to hear that and not instantly go, no, I don't. Well, you talk to me really badly too. Well, you started it, blah, blah, blah. Rather than say, so what I'm hearing is you are uncomfortable with the way that I'm talking to you. Can you tell me some more about that? So having the emotional regulation to be able to actually ask that question, because here's the thing, if somebody is telling you about their feelings, and I this is kind of part of how I approach it, if somebody is telling you about their feelings, they're putting the focus on themselves. If we keep the focus on them in a nice way, then what we'll do is that we'll find out a little bit more. But here's the crucial thing, is why talking works. When we talk, it comes out of our mouth and goes back in our ears. So sometimes that woman that you can't work out what the heck she means needs to be able to say it just as you do, to get it out of your mouth, back in your ears, where a whole different part of your brain analyzes the information and changes the information. So in that ability to have these conversations, by asking that question, keeping the focus, you're telling me about your feelings. Can you tell me some more? Like I'm sure you do with your children. We do it quite naturally. Oh, you've had a bad day at school. Can you tell me a little bit more? You don't say, oh, well, I'm going to bring up, Mrs. X, Y, and Z and do something. Because when you ask them a little more, you're deepening their understanding of what they are thinking and feeling. And then you're deepening your own understanding of what they're thinking and feeling. So these are all little micro techniques of just where you're putting the attention. But they are the things.
And you'll never get it. We're all like a work in progress. And for me, as much as anybody, having 3 kids and my partner Emma, and you're running businesses and juggling sleep, and we have chickens and guinea pigs, and parents are unwell and whatever. Sometimes you have stuff where you'll react and on reflection, a minute or seconds or later, you'll think, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. But at least you've got the awareness that you try to reduce those times instead of thinking, oh, well, that's just the way it is. And this is why I talk a lot about the guys in my membership, as it were. I say, if you have awareness, that's like step 1, because if you don't even realize what you're doing, you don't know how to carry on. If you do, at least sometimes you can catch yourself and think, I just shout at the kids. I didn't mean to. Like, what can I do to rectify that?
Yeah. Well, they do say we can't change what we don't notice. So once we notice it, we can feel a lot of shame and embarrassment. But knowing that shame and embarrassment is our body telling us we don't want to feel that way anymore. So we can either mask it and shut it down, or we can go, do you know what? I am really ashamed. It was one of the things I learned in my divorce. It was very easy to say it was all my ex-husband's fault. I had to admit it was my fault too. And in doing that, it released me into being able to understand stuff and learn. Otherwise, I wouldn't have learned. And I needed to learn, A, so I can do this work, but also so I can be, I don't know, what's the point of being alive if you're not trying to improve? I'm going to kind of draw it to a close there, because I've realised I meant to put timer on and just didn't, because that's how women do things. But, what would you leave the listeners with, Anthony? What would your kind of, your pearls and nuggets about difficult conversations be?
In my years, in fact, even if you added my corporate career, which you had a lot of, when I say difficult conversations, but it was a very highly pressurized environment where you were dealing with lots of money, lots of stress, lots of egos. Conversations there had to be very measured, and they were recorded, which you have to be very careful. Yeah. But since I left there, what I saw, and I always talk from the view of the men that I work with, is that, again, we are all a work in progress. And, at some point you get it all right. Other times shit goes on in your life and you have an up and a down time. But for me, the big thing is, if you can surround yourself with the right kind of people, it makes life so much easier. And you're always going to find people that want to moan about everything and be negative. And not saying you should only ever be positive, because sometimes you might need to vent and you're upset and whatever. But, what your attitude is like, I think resonates and will either attract people or repel them. So for me, it's always looking in the mirror first, seeing if you're working on yourself, hopefully that will help ripple out to all the other people around you.
Completely agree. And I think to work on yourself, just working on yourself physically, mentally and emotionally is to really be commended. I had a client once, and they used to explain everything in highly over dramatic ways. And then they went, oh, you know what, my life's gone all EastEnders. And it was this kind of idea that where we are, the way we convey stuff, the way we talk about stuff, the way we speak and the way we conduct ourselves is not the same as repressing and shutting down. It's about acting with grace and intention and purpose, and knowing that it does matter. And so, I completely agree with that. So, Anthony, thank you so much. If people want to reach out, if they're listening to this and they say, I need a bit of the Whole Man Academy, like what's the steps for them if they want to reach out and contact you or work with you or come to some of your retreats or stuff?
Good question. Quickest way is just wholemanacademy.com, which is the website. And for men that are listening, or maybe wives or girlfriends that point them in the direction, I have 3 different tiers of membership, basically. And that is a very low cost one, which is a no-brainer, but helps guys get a foothold for accountability and a bit of motivation. And then there's a middle one, which is a general kind of any guy can join it, which is slightly higher priced, but again, you get access to more tools and more to me. And then there's one which is purely business owners, which is basically British business owners and operators. And that's for guys that want to grow business, improve their life, and are prepared to kind of also have some great experiences. Because I think life, I like guys to get to the end of each year and look back and think, what did I do this year that was bloody exciting? So that's all. All the information's on the Whole Man Academy website, and I'm on pretty much all social media platforms under either my name or Whole Man Academy. So I'm always interested to hear from people.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I will put all of the website and so forth and the details in the show notes that will be going out. So, but again, wholemanacademy.com. So you can go and find. So Anthony, thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that for the listeners, what you've heard is there is a perspective and it's okay to talk about these things. There are people who are willing to talk about all of these things that are happening, and we can feel very much like we're in isolation, or we can feel ashamed, or we can feel shut down. And there are people out there like Anthony, like you, Anthony, who are talking about this in a balanced, measured way, not falling into the more dramatic, shall we call it, polarities of some of the places that people can find on the internet that are largely non-constructive. They're not building, they're breaking. And what you're talking about is building. And I absolutely love that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care. And we'll see you on the next one sometime soon.